Hey, book lovers. Want to hear a story? Welcome back to Storytime with M. This is a bonus episode from the Books and Cats universe, where I am sharing my books a chapter a week. Currently, we are just getting started on the oldest of my books that is still available for purchase. You can find it on Amazon. It's on Kindle. I believe I wrote it in like 2009, maybe. It is a high school horror story called Do You Remember Ella? And this week is chapter 2. Enjoy. Do you remember fairy tales of witches and princesses too? Do you delight in fanciful tales, no matter if they're true? Have you spun a web of lies to ensnare unsuspecting fellas? Most important question of all, do you remember Ella? Valeria's note fell out of my book during English class, and I hurried to pick it up. I looked up to see if she'd noticed, but she was laughing and talking loudly to Brando and Stephen. Almost a week had passed since her strange visit, and she had been more unpleasant to me than usual. There were several rumors circling the campus concerning the many scandalous reasons for my destructive behavior. It didn't matter that the administration had found that there was no way I could have done it. The rumors continued, and I knew Valeria was behind them all. The bright blue letter was intriguing. The handwriting looked like Ella's, and I wondered if she was playing some kind of trick on the school. I hoped she would come back. The few people that had spoken to me before the rumors spread now avoided looking at me when I passed them in the halls. Byron avoided me when he could. He was silent and grim when we worked on labs together, and he had started avoiding the computer lab in the evenings. I had no one to talk to, and I was bored with my own company. Something was off, but I couldn't place what it was. As I hurried up 4 flights of stairs to algebra, I was trying to decide what was wrong with everyone. Even if I had painted the faces of former headmasters, it shouldn't have caused this kind of reaction. Teachers watched me everywhere I went. Students whispered behind their hands. There were so many rumors that I lost track of them all. They ranged from simple insults to absolute absurdity. I was late for class, and Mrs. Miller crossed her arms over her chest and waited silently for me to take a seat in the front row. The only open desk was in front of Marcus, and he pushed back a golden strand of hair and smiled at me. The class whispered and giggled until Mrs. Miller's sharp voice cut through the noise and started lecturing again. I felt a tap on my shoulder a few minutes later and turned to find Marcus still smiling at me. He handed me a small piece of paper. It had been folded numerous times until it was a thick cube the size of a quarter. My hands shook while I tried to unfold the note under my desk. I was hot and sweating from the brief touch of his fingers in mine, and I knew my face was the color of a tomato. I hated the way everything made me blush. I couldn't control it, and it made any slight discomfort very apparent to everyone around me. I was having trouble getting the note unfolded, and Mrs. Miller kept looking at me with her small, squinty eyes. I glanced around the room. Trinity, Valeria's best friend and the school's best downhill skier, was glaring at me. I had never even spoken to her, and I wondered what kind of lies Valeria had told her about me. Again, I had to wonder what it was that I had done to deserve all this. The bell rang before I could get the note open, and as I gathered my books to leave, I heard Mrs. Miller call my name. The other students laughed, and my cheeks burned as I approached her desk. She didn't speak until the door closed behind the last student, and even then, she looked at me for a long time before she said anything. I'd always liked Mrs. Miller, even after she'd started ignoring me. She was nice and grandmotherly, and her love for math was something that I could admire, though not truly understand. She was short and plump and always wore her hair pulled back in a thick white braid. Her clothes were bright and shapeless, and she made most of them herself. She laced her wrinkled fingers and leaned her chin against them. She looked at me through a few loose strands of hair that had fallen into her eyes. "Sophie," she sighed heavily and stood up. She walked to the window and stared out at the tops of the nearby buildings. Her face was sad and hopeless, but she gave me a small, tired smile when she turned back to me. "Are you all right, Sophie?" "Yeah, of course." She looked at me for a moment longer before she sighed again. "Very well. If you ever need to talk, come and find me in the dorm, okay?" I nodded, and she waved toward the door. She sat at her desk and rested her head in her hands. I wondered how old she was. She'd been teaching at CA longer than everyone else, but no one seemed to know her age or anything about her past. The campus was alive at the end of the school day. Students sprawled on benches or tossed footballs on the quad. As I stepped into the cold November sunshine, I heard a squeal and turned in time to see Marcus lift Valeria into the air and spin her around. She wrapped her arms around his neck and laughed. Her friends watched and giggled from a bench nearby. I tried to get past them unnoticed, but Valeria saw me. Even before her feet touched the ground, she was smiling her cruel little smile that seemed to be born from malice as opposed to joy. Her friends turned to me as a group, and their eyes rooted me to the ground. Trinity and Valeria's other minions surrounded me. Between them, I could see Valeria approaching. She kissed Marcus and began her predatory saunter toward me. They parted for her, and she stood with her face just inches from mine. Careful, Val. She might try to kiss you. Trinity and the other girls burst into loud, forced laughter. The guys moved in closer, hoping for a catfight, but I wasn't going to comply. Valeria laughed and looked around at her audience. I don't think I'm her type. She laughed loudly and then leaned in close. Cut this shit out, or I will make your life hell. She pushed me away, and I stumbled down the walkway. I could hear them laughing and calling out insults. I saw Marcus watching me. He was standing near Valeria, and she was doing everything in her power to get his attention. He answered her questions, but he was looking at me. His expression was blank, and I had to wonder if he actually saw me. I still hadn't read the note. I had forgotten about it when faced with Valeria's hatred. I ran back to my dorm and locked the door. I sat on the bed and took a deep breath to calm my shaking hands. I unfolded the rest of the intricate folds and spread the note out in front of me. It was a drawing. On a piece of notebook paper, Marcus had sketched me riding a giant eagle while he floated in the air beside me. We were laughing, and he looked at me intently while I gazed off into the distance. My hair flowed out behind me and swirled into a halo around him. It was beautiful, and it made my heart race. The rest of the night was spent pondering the newest piece of this strange puzzle and daydreaming about Marcus. I skipped dinner again. No one seemed to notice my absence, or they were glad I wasn't around to make things uncomfortable. I had just started to doze off when someone pounded on my door. Valeria was standing in the hall with her hands on her hips. Her posture was tough, but her face was pale and scared. She thrust another bright blue letter into my hands. Look, I don't know what you think you know, but I wasn't even there. What are you talking about? She grew more nervous and glared at me. Just stop writing these fucking letters. They're really creeping me out. I had no idea what she was talking about, but I saw my chance. Stop spreading lies about me, and I'll consider it. Done. She looked relieved and ran away quickly to avoid being seen. She was lucky. Trinity came out of her room a moment later. She gave me a nasty look. I closed the door slowly. The paper was the same blinding shade of blue, and the handwriting was the same. Tattletale, tattletale, soon your lips will start to fail. Your words will soon cease to matter, while the worms of the earth grow fatter. The time is coming soon, you'll lose your brand new fella. But when it is time to say goodbye, will you remember Ella? This letter was far more sinister than the first, and it obviously had Valeria spooked. There had been real terror in her eyes, and there was a part of me that loved it. I hoped it was Ella playing a nasty trick. Valeria had always been a bitch. Everything was easy for her. She had stolen everything from Ella. She had taunted her and lied about her, and she deserved to be scared. I liked the part about her losing Marcus. He had drawn me as far more beautiful than I really was, and his strange, silent devotion was intriguing. Valeria ruined the fantasy for me, and I would have been grateful to have her out of the way. However, I didn't wish her harm. She was a cruel bitch, but I wouldn't wish physical harm on anyone. Ella wasn't like me. She was not above physical violence, and the taunting and rumors bothered her. When she was on a downswing, she had episodes that would send her away for a few days or so. Her parents were always able to get her back into school. They weren't overly wealthy by CA standards, but they had enough money to keep her there. Her family's connections to the school went back to the establishment of the academy, and her great-grandfather had been headmaster for several decades. I was quickly becoming convinced that the letters were from Ella. I began looking for her around campus. I walked the low hills surrounding the school and the paths that wound their way through the forest. A few days after Valeria gave me the second letter, I walked out an abandoned path that led to an old farmhouse. Ella and I had been there before. We had decided to take a break from running lines and go for a walk. It was 2 years ago, and spring had just come to campus. The snow had melted, and the air was cold, fresh, and new. We found the trail by accident. Ella tripped and fell near the old sign. I wanted to go back, but Ella was uncharacteristically talkative that day and begged me to explore with her. She was constantly searching for spirituality among the trees, and she was certain that we would find something magical at the end of the trail. Years before Cullen Academy was even a thought, the land had been a small farming community called Yorkshire Hills. The town had stayed the same for years, but life was hard. The soil wasn't great for crops, the winters were harsh, came early, and stayed too long. The school made the townspeople an offer they couldn't refuse, and Yorkshire Hills was torn down, except for one lone farmhouse. Ella loved it there. During some of her more somber moments, when her depression drove her away from people, I always knew where to find her. I never told anyone where she went. I respected her need for privacy. I understood it. The faculty of CA made it almost impossible to find a moment alone. Every second of the day was scheduled, and there was always some teacher or dorm parent hovering nearby. The house was old but well built, and only the last remaining bits of paint clinging to the outside walls revealed its age. There were places on the front porch and throughout the house where the floorboards were beginning to rot away. But if you stepped carefully, you could walk through the entire house. Upstairs, there were 3 small bedrooms. The largest might have been the size of my dorm room. The stairs leading up to them were steep and narrow, and some of the steps were missing or broken. I didn't go upstairs the first time we went there. I'm a bit of a klutz and didn't trust my balance. The first floor was split into a kitchen and living area. Some of the furniture remained, and it was rotten and home to several generations of mice. They scattered when we entered the living room, and Ella and I both screamed. She laughed, but I was shaking and wanted to leave. She just kept laughing. There was a wild look in her eyes that I knew from her manic phases, and it worried me more than her brooding depressions. She went to explore the upstairs, and I was left alone with the mice. I could hear them moving around in the sofa, the chairs, and even the walls. The room felt as if it would swallow me at any moment. That was when I saw the blood. The floor was covered with it. I screamed, but I couldn't look away. The mice came out of their hiding places and crawled through it. They swam in slow circles and squeaked incessantly. I screamed again and again. I was so wild with the horror of it that I felt I might not be able to stop. Ella's hand on my shoulder snapped me out of it, and I turned to face her. When I tried to show her the blood, she gave me a strange look. "There's no blood, Sophie. Look." The blood was gone. The mice had also returned to their nests, and everything was rotting away under a thick layer of dust. I started to cry. It was there. Ella put her arm around me and turned me toward the door. "Let's go. It's almost dinner time." We didn't talk about it on the walk back. I had several more embarrassing episodes before we would address the subject. Ella got really excited and called it a special power, but I wasn't sure. Every once in a while, I would see blood, and it took some time to master my reactions. It wasn't pleasant, and I often wondered why it had to happen to me. The farmhouse was unchanged, except for a new layer of brown leaves that littered the yard and covered the roof. I didn't enter this time. I sat on the rotten porch steps and stared at the notes. I couldn't decide if Valeria was playing a trick and planning to ridicule me later, or if there was actually something to this. My curiosity was piqued, and the part of me that loved mystery novels was itching to play detective. A rustle in the trees next to the house made me jump to my feet. I crammed the notes into the pockets of my jeans and turned nervously toward the sound. My heart was already racing when Marcus stepped out of the woods. It sped up even more at the sight of his smile. "Hey, Sophie." Hi." He leaned against the warped porch railing and grinned at me. "Have you been here before?" "Yeah, with Ella." Who's Ella? A friend of mine. She used to go to CA. She came here a lot. This place is pretty cool. I found it last week when I was out running the trails. Being so close to him made me nervous. His drawing was in my pocket, and I thought about taking it out and asking him about it. He was watching me, and I knew I should say something. My mind, however, was a complete blank. I laughed nervously instead, and he smiled and held out his hand. Come with me. I want to show you something. I took his hand and followed him around the house. By the back stairs was a beautiful rose bush. It was tangled in the weeds of a long, overgrown garden, and the pretty pink blossoms had already dropped many of their petals amongst the brown, withered grass. Marcus bent down and picked one of the few remaining blossoms and handed it to me with a shy smile. It's beautiful. Like you. His smile was white and wonderful, and I didn't know how to respond. This kind of thing didn't happen to weird, awkward girls like me. It was a fantasy come to life. I laughed again and turned bright red. He laughed. Come on, let's go back. He held my hand as we walked down the overgrown trail. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was sure he could hear it. We didn't say anything on the way back to campus. When we got to the road, he kissed my hand and smiled. I have to go. Valeria is waiting. Her name made the smile die on my lips. He started jogging down the road toward the athletic fields, and I stood and watched him go. If I hadn't still held the rose in my hand, I would have thought it was a dream, but the sweet-smelling petals were still clenched between my fingers. I carried it back to my room and pressed it between the pages of my copy of Romeo and Juliet. The mysterious letters were momentarily forgotten, and I spent the evening looking at the drawings and fantasizing about Marcus. I refused to think of Valeria. It was a pleasant way to spend the evening, but I kept wishing I had someone I could talk to about it. It made me miss Ella. She would have been excited and happy for me, and willing to listen to me go on about Marcus for hours. She might have even tried to guess why he was letting Valeria hang all over him. The next morning during breakfast, Mr. Tilson appeared at my table. His face was pale and angry. He didn't say anything in reply to my greeting. He motioned for me to come with him, and I grabbed my bag and followed him out of the dining hall. He strode quickly down the walk to the theater building and down into the basement where the dressing rooms were located. Mr. Tilson, what's going on? He stopped suddenly and wheeled around. His face was red, and I could see the rage barely contained just below the surface. Sophie, you have always been a good student and a good actor. I stood up for you, you know. After the last prank, I told everyone there was no way you could have done it. You're a good girl who would never do something so disgraceful. But this is too much, Sophie. Even I can't stand up for you now. What are you talking about? He laughed bitterly, and his eyes flashed. You're not that good an actress, Sophie. Why couldn't you stop? They couldn't pin the last one on you, but this. There's no way to get out of it. I know you miss her, but it was her parents' choice to remove her from the school. Nothing you do is going to bring her back. Why not just leave it alone? Mr. Tilson, what happened? I have no idea what you're talking about. He sighed and pushed open the door to the dressing room. The floor was covered with shattered glass. Every mirror had been smashed, as well as most of the light bulbs that surrounded them. Above the mirrors, in the same blood-red paint, were the words, "Do you remember Ella?" Who keeps doing this? Mr. Tilson sighed again. I can't help you this time, Sophie. You've gone too far. He walked me to Mr. Franklin's office. Headmaster Quincy and Joe Blood, the head of security, were there already. I sat down in a chair and waited. Mr. Tilson cleared his throat nervously. I brought her to the dressing room. She denies everything. Mr. Franklin's stare was filled with hatred, and his eyes never left my face, as he dismissed Mr. Tilson with a flip of his thick wrist. They didn't speak for a long time after he left. I tried to look each one of them in the eye, but my courage failed. I had to look away from Mr. Franklin's undisguised hatred. Headmaster Quincy coughed and adjusted his tie. He tapped his fingers against the desktop and glanced quickly at the two hulking monsters beside him. Sophie, this kind of behavior is absolutely unacceptable. I'm afraid that we must consider taking action. Your parents will have to be called. Headmaster Quincy, I swear I had nothing to do with this. You lying little. Mr. Franklin lunged across the desk. His red face was inches from mine, and as he spoke, he covered my face with a fine layer of spittle. Mr. Franklin, get a hold of yourself. Mr. Blood. Joe Blood restrained Mr. Franklin while Headmaster Quincy led me out of the office. As we walked quickly down the hall, he mopped his brow with a handkerchief. He ushered me into his office and closed the door. I sat down in a chair, and he leaned against the large, glossy desktop. He was breathing heavily and almost knocked all of his pictures over when his hand slipped and sent him off balance. He straightened himself and removed his glasses, cleaned them, and replaced them upon his nose. Sophie, I want to believe that you had nothing to do with this. You've always been an excellent student and a kind, honest person. You're far superior to most of your peers, and I have a difficult time understanding why you would do something like this. I haven't done anything, sir. I don't know what's going on, but I think someone is trying to frame me. Why would anyone do that? I don't know. We sat in silence for a while. I tried to imagine what my father would say when they called him. It had been difficult convincing him to send me to CA. He thought that the local high school was the best option for me. He'd been king of the school when he was there, and he had high hopes that I would be the same. I'd wanted something more, and had no interest in being homecoming queen of some dinky public high school. We fought every day, right up until the morning they dropped me off. He rarely speaks to me now. When he does, it's always something derogatory about private schools and rich kids. This would give him the perfect reason to pull me out and send me to his precious alma mater. I wasn't sure if that would be good or bad at this point. Headmaster Quincy cleared his throat again. I'm not going to call your parents, Sophie. There is no evidence that you had anything to do with this. Where were you yesterday afternoon? I paused. The farmhouse was off limits to students, and I didn't need more trouble. I went for a walk on the nature trails. Alone. Yes, sir. I couldn't be sure that Marcus would admit to being with me, and I didn't want to involve him in this mess. If he actually liked me, I wanted a chance to find out before I drove him away. Headmaster Quincy closed his eyes and massaged his temples. He looked incredibly tired, and I had a sudden wave of compassion for him. Whoever was behind this was making his usually easy and enjoyable job a nightmare, and he was not the kind of man that could weather a storm like this one. Very well. Go to class and behave yourself. There's going to be more than one person keeping close watch on you, and you can't afford any slip-ups right now. Thank you, sir. As I closed the door, I saw him sit at his desk and lay his head on his arms. His shoulders shook, and I wondered if he was crying. I heard my name, and when I saw Mr. Franklin coming toward me, I ran for my English class and was safely in my seat when the final bell rang. He could still pull me out of class, but he would have to make a scene. I didn't think he'd do it. He had been showing very little restraint lately, and I had a feeling that Headmaster Quincy was keeping a close watch on him as well. I was safe as long as I kept my head down and did my work like a good girl. That was fine with me. I'd had enough mysteries for one school year. And that is the end of Chapter 2. We are just getting started. I hope you are enjoying Do You Remember Ella? Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a beautiful week, and until next time, keep reading.
A Frap Media production.